This man is talking about blowing up the school. As a result, the class he was leading blew up. The class was in ruins. Not a single student survived. Neil was so frightened that he hid in his house. He saw 2 piles of poo on the floor and said, "Clean it up yourself." The 2 piles of poo came back to life, jumped up and headed for the toilet. The 2 piles of poo then made a magnificent 360-degree dive, a perfect dive, and ended up flushing the toilet themselves. Neil was shocked and thought he'd been dreaming. He then took out his whiskey to clear his head, but accidentally spilled it. He then realized it wasn't a dream. He said, "Put the whiskey back in the bottle." The whiskey really did go back into the bottle. He finally realized he had superpowers. Isn't that crazy? The students were killed by Neil, so he made another wish to bring the dead back to life. As a result, all the corpses in the morgue rose. The staff screamed in fear. Not only the corpses in the morgue, but also the dry corpses in the cemetery came back to life. The streets are full of zombies. It's horrible. Neil was so frightened that he withdrew his wish, but he had another brilliant idea. He wished the explosion would never happen. He traveled to this morning before the explosion. At that moment, aliens were watching Neil. It turns out that Neil got his powers from the aliens. The aliens make a bet. They randomly choose an Earthling to give him a superpower and give him 5 days. If the Earthman uses his power to do something bad, the aliens will destroy the Earth immediately. The lucky man's name is Neil. The man has a powerful superpower. All he has to do is wave his little hand and millions of euros are instantly available. Neil no longer has to eat by himself, and even his clothes dress themselves automatically. He lives a very happy life thanks to his powers. He can't even become Einstein, and if he's not satisfied, he can't get a perfect body with a wave of his hand. Walking along the road, he has another daring idea. He wants to become president of the United States of America. Just then, 2 bodyguards got out of the car and let Neil in. The bodyguards then had to pull out all sorts of documents for Neil to approve as if fled from his pursuers. Syria, the deficit, Israel and the Middle East, East Asia, global warming, unemployment and the Arctic Nature Reserve. Neil takes fright and sends him a wish to transform again. Once back home, Neil found his powers extraordinary and wanted to make a wish for the goddess to fall in love with him. But just as he was finishing his wish, the doorbell rang. They began to kiss passionately, but the goddess' fervent suitor saw it all from the window. The next day, Neil invited the goddess to dinner. He wanted to show that he had great powers. For example, he could make the dog talk. He could turn the goddess' office into a big desk, or show her a beautiful view, but the goddess thought Neil was joking with her. Just then, the goddess' fervent suitor burst through the window. Grant pulled out a gun and threatened Neil to leave his goddess, but Grant had no idea what awaited him. Neil unleashed his powers and knocked Grant's gun away. Then they both fought. The goddess was so frightened that she ran away. Neil continues to tease Grant with his powers. Grant hits the ceiling, then the wall, then Neil puts Grant in a flower pot. Finally, Neil gives Grant $10 million to get away from the goddess, but before Grant can react, Neil takes the money back. Grant has been tricked by Neil, but then Grant has a daring idea. As soon as Neil turned around, Grant grabbed a flower pot and knocked him out. Neil awoke tied up and unable to move. Grant even grabbed Neil's dog. Grant wanted to threaten Neil into helping him fulfill his wish, or he would shoot the dog. The dog was kidnapped. The kidnapper demands that the dog's owner use supernatural powers to grant him his wish, otherwise he shoots the dog. The first wish was for all Britons to grow pig's ears, then duck feet. The second was for all police uniforms to be pink. The third is a ton of gold bars. Neil's goddess returned to the office. What was a small square table becomes a very large one with a magnificent view. The goddess finally believes that Neil has supernatural powers and rushes off to look for him. Neil has already been forced to read over 300 wishes. He puts on a dress and becomes a flower girl, but the kidnapper has become a great general. By the time the goddess arrives, the kidnapper forced Neil to make the goddess fall deeply in love with him. At this point, the goddess transformed into another person. The goddess then jumped on the kidnapper and fell in love with him. Neil took the opportunity to save the dog. He freed himself and transformed the kidnapper into a corgi. Neil also undid all the kidnapper's wishes. The drama was finally over, but the goddess was furious because Neil only cares about the dog's life, not the goddess' opinion, and so Neil lost his love. Then he had to eat with the dog. Neil thought he had to use his powers to do something good, so he vowed to feed and house everyone on the planet, and that no one, no country, would ever again have an excuse to start a war against anyone. Then he turned on the news to see the wonderful world he'd created. But he was shocked. No one wanted to work anymore because of food surpluses. Houses were being built in the Sahara Desert, affecting the environment, and war is even more out of control. They go to war with no excuse. Neil was so shocked that he withdrew his wish. He felt like a failure, having such a powerful superpower, but not being able to make the world a better place. So the dog asked Neil to give him his powers for good. So Neil gave his powers to the dog. Meanwhile, the 5 days the aliens had given Neil had expired. The aliens decided to destroy Earth because of Neil's ridiculous behavior with his powers. The spaceship fires a laser beam at Earth. At this point, the dog vows to use this magical power to destroy the source forever. The laser bounces back instantly and the aliens are defeated by the dog. They had saved their Earth without realizing it. Since then, Neil has pursued the goddess like an ordinary man, and they lived happily ever after as a family of 4.